The humid Manila air hung heavy as Manny Pacquiao stepped out of his black SUV onto the cracked pavement of Barangay Tondo. This wasn't a scheduled visit, no cameras followed him, and no entourage surrounded the boxing legend. He had come alone, drawn by a letter that had arrived at his office 3 days earlier. The handwriting was shaky, the paper cheap, but the words had pierced through his heart like nothing had in years. A young man named Miguel Santos had written about how Pacquiao's story had saved his life, pulling him away from the gangs that ruled these very streets. Now Miguel had requested just 5 minutes of the champion's time. The narrow alleyways of Tondo stretched before Manny like a maze of memories. These streets mirrored the ones from his own childhood in General Santos City, where poverty had been his constant companion and hope seemed as distant as the stars. Children played barefoot in the dust, their laughter echoing off the corrugated metal walls of makeshift homes. Mothers hung laundry on lines stretched between buildings, their weathered hands telling stories of endless struggle. The smell of cooking rice mixed with the urban decay, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and heartbreaking to the man who had once called similar places home. As Manny walked deeper into the community, residents began to recognize him. Whispers followed in his wake, but he moved with purpose toward the address written in Miguel's letter. The house stood at the end of a dead-end street, its walls painted in faded blue, with a small sari-sari store occupying the front room. An elderly woman sat on a plastic chair outside, her eyes widening in disbelief as she realized who was approaching. She quickly stood, smoothing her worn dress, and pointed toward a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. Her trembling finger and silent nod told Manny everything he needed to know. The wooden steps creaked under Manny's weight as he climbed toward what he assumed was Miguel's home. Each step brought back memories of his own humble beginnings, of climbing similar stairs to cramped rooms where dreams seemed impossible. The walls were thin, and he could hear the sounds of daily life from neighboring units. A baby crying, a television playing a local drama, the clatter of dishes being washed. These were the sounds of survival, the soundtrack of communities where people made do with whatever they had, finding joy in the smallest victories. At the top of the stairs, Manny found a door slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see a young man sitting at a small wooden table, his head buried in a book. The room was tiny but meticulously clean, with boxing posters covering every inch of the walls. Most prominently displayed was a large photograph of Manny himself, arms raised in victory after one of his championship fights. Below it, newspaper clippings and magazine articles about the boxing legend were carefully arranged, creating a shrine to the man who now stood just outside the door. The devotion was evident, but it was the sight of textbooks and notebooks scattered across the table that truly caught Manny's attention. Manny knocked gently on the doorframe, his heart racing with anticipation. The young man looked up, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Miguel Santos was perhaps 20 years old, with the lean build of someone who had known hunger but possessed eyes that burned with determination. His face bore small scars, evidence of a past that had been far from easy, but his expression transformed from confusion to absolute shock as he realized who stood before him. The book slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between them. Miguel's hands shook as he stood up, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. For 3 years, he had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was happening, words seemed to abandon him completely. Manny stepped into the small room, his presence filling the space with an energy that was both calming and electric. The boxing champion's eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail, the makeshift punching bag hanging in the corner, the certificates of academic achievement pinned to the wall, and the small altar with a picture of the Santo Niño surrounded by flickering candles. This was the room of someone who had found faith, purpose, and direction. The silence stretched between them until Manny spoke first, his voice gentle and warm. He thanked Miguel for the letter, explaining how it had moved him to make this unannounced visit. Miguel's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to find his voice, finally managing to invite the champion to sit on the room's only chair while he remained standing. The young man's respect was evident in every gesture, but Manny insisted they sit together on the small bed that doubled as a couch. As they settled side by side, Miguel began to share his story, his voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger with each word. Miguel's tale unfolded like a dark mirror of Manny's own childhood, but with even more dangerous turns. He had grown up in these same streets, raised by a grandmother who worked as a laundrywoman to keep them fed. His parents had abandoned him when he was 7, leaving him to navigate the harsh realities of Tondo alone. By the time he was 14, the local gang had recruited him, offering the family and protection he desperately craved. The money from small crimes had helped his grandmother buy medicine for her diabetes, but Miguel knew he was walking a path that led nowhere good. Violence became his daily reality, and hope seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. The turning point had come 3 years earlier, during one of the darkest periods of Miguel's life. He had been involved in a gang fight that left him hospitalized with a knife wound to his shoulder. As he lay in the charity ward of a public hospital, a nurse had left a small radio by his bedside. That night, unable to sleep due to the pain, he had listened to a documentary about Manny Pacquiao's rise from poverty. The program detailed how the champion had faced similar struggles, how he had been homeless and hungry, yet had never given up on his dreams. For the first time in years, Miguel had cried not from physical pain but from the realization that another path was possible. From that hospital bed, Miguel had made a decision that would change everything. He would leave the gang, return to school, and fight for a better life, just as his hero had done. The transition wasn't easy. Former gang members faced constant threats, and his grandmother worried about their safety and finances. Miguel had to prove his commitment by working double shifts at a local market while attending night classes to complete his high school education. He trained at a small boxing gym in the mornings, not because he dreamed of becoming a professional fighter, but because the discipline and physical challenge reminded him daily of the strength required to change his life. As Miguel spoke, Manny listened with the intensity of someone who understood every word on a deeply personal level. The young man's voice grew stronger as he described his current life, how he was now in his 2nd year of college, studying social work with dreams of helping other young people escape the cycle of poverty and violence. He worked part-time as a peer counselor at a local community center, sharing his story with teenagers who were facing the same choices he had once confronted. His grandmother, now in better health thanks to proper medical care Miguel could afford, had become his biggest supporter, proud of the man her grandson had become. Manny felt a familiar tightness in his chest as Miguel continued his story, the same feeling he experienced whenever he returned to his hometown and saw the faces of people who had found hope in his journey. The young man reached under his bed and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten quotes and life lessons he had extracted from every interview, documentary, and article about the boxing champion. Miguel explained how he had created his own personal philosophy based on Manny's words about perseverance, faith, and giving back to the community. Each page represented a step in his transformation, a reminder of the principles that had guided him away from the darkness. The notebook revealed the depth of Miguel's dedication to change. He had documented not just Manny's victories in the ring, but his losses as well, finding inspiration in how the champion had bounced back from defeat. Miguel had written detailed analyses of Manny's training routines, not to become a boxer himself, but to understand the discipline required for any form of success. Pages were dedicated to Manny's charitable work, with Miguel noting every school built, every family helped, every community project supported. The young man had used these examples as a blueprint for his own small acts of service in Tondo. As Miguel turned the pages, he shared how Manny's story had given him the courage to face his former gang members when they tried to pull him back into their world. He had learned to fight with words instead of fists, using the champion's example of rising above circumstances to convince other young people that education and hard work offered a better path than crime. Miguel had organized study groups in his neighborhood, turning abandoned lots into makeshift classrooms where children could do homework safely. His grandmother's small store had become an unofficial community center where teenagers gathered to discuss their dreams instead of planning their next illegal activity. The most powerful section of the notebook contained letters Miguel had written but never sent to Manny over the years. These pages revealed the young man's deepest struggles and victories, his moments of doubt and his renewed determination. He had written to his hero during his first week back in school, when classmates mocked him for being older than everyone else. He had poured his heart out after his first semester, when he had earned the highest grades in his class. Each letter was a conversation with the man who had unknowingly become his mentor, a way of processing his journey through the lens of Manny's example. Manny's eyes grew moist as he read passages from these unsent letters. Miguel's words revealed not just admiration, but a deep understanding of the responsibility that came with overcoming adversity. The young man had written about feeling obligated to succeed, not just for himself, but for every other kid in Tondo who needed to see that change was possible. He had documented his fears about failing, about disappointing his grandmother, about not being strong enough to maintain his new path. But in every letter, he had found strength by remembering that Manny had faced similar doubts and had persevered. The final entry in the notebook was the letter Miguel had actually sent, the one that had brought Manny to this small room. In it, Miguel had expressed his gratitude not just for the inspiration, but for showing him that success wasn't measured only by fame or money, but by the positive impact one could have on others. He had written about his dream of becoming a social worker, of opening a community center that would provide alternatives to gang life for young people. Miguel had asked for just a few minutes of Manny's time, not for an autograph or a photo, but to say thank you and to promise that he would continue the cycle of inspiration by helping others find their own path to redemption. Manny closed the notebook carefully, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of Miguel's journey settled in his heart. The boxing champion looked around the small room again, seeing it now through different eyes, not as a place of poverty, but as a sanctuary of transformation. He began to share his own memories, speaking of nights when he had gone to bed hungry, of the shame he had felt wearing the same clothes to school day after day, of the moments when giving up seemed like the only logical choice. His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had traveled the full distance from desperation to triumph, yet had never forgotten the taste of struggle. The conversation flowed naturally as both men discovered the striking parallels in their experiences. Manny spoke of his mother Dionysia's sacrifices, working multiple jobs to keep the family together, much like Miguel's grandmother had done. He described the feeling of being looked down upon by others who had more, the way poverty could make a person feel invisible and worthless. Miguel nodded with understanding, sharing how he had often felt like he didn't belong anywhere, too poor for the legitimate world, too sensitive for the criminal one. These shared emotions created an instant bond between the champion and his young admirer. Manny revealed something he rarely discussed in interviews, the guilt he had carried for years about the choices he had made during his own difficult youth. He spoke of small acts of desperation, of times when hunger had driven him to decisions he wasn't proud of the shame that had motivated him to work even harder once opportunities arose. Miguel listened with rapt attention, realizing that his hero's journey had included moral struggles similar to his own. This revelation didn't diminish Manny in Miguel's eyes. Instead, it made the champion's ultimate success even more meaningful and attainable. The boxing legend described the moment when he had first realized that his success could be used to help others escape the cycle of poverty. He talked about the responsibility he felt every time he returned to the Philippines, knowing that millions of people saw him as proof that dreams could come true. Manny explained how this awareness had shaped every decision he made, from his training regimen to his business ventures to his political career. Miguel shared his own growing sense of responsibility, describing how other young people in Tondo had begun to look up to him as an example of positive change. As the afternoon sun streamed through the small window, casting long shadows across the room, both men reflected on the power of second chances. Manny spoke about fights he had lost and how those defeats had taught him more than his victories ever could. He emphasized that true strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time life knocked you down. Miguel shared his own setbacks, the nights when he had been tempted to return to his old life, the financial struggles that had made him question his choices, the loneliness that came with walking away from the only community he had known. The conversation turned to family, and Manny's voice softened as he spoke about his wife Jinky and their children, Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel. He described the challenge of raising children who would never know poverty while ensuring they understood the value of hard work and compassion for others. Miguel listened intently, sharing his dreams of one day having a family of his own, of being able to provide for them while teaching them the lessons he had learned through struggle. Both men understood that breaking cycles of poverty and violence required not just personal transformation, but a commitment to raising the next generation with different values and opportunities. Miguel stood up and walked to a small wooden box tucked beneath his study table, his movements careful and reverent. Inside, he kept what he called his evidence of change, photographs, certificates, and letters that documented his transformation and its impact on others. The first item he showed Manny was a group photo from his high school graduation, where he stood surrounded by his grandmother and several younger neighborhood children who had started attending school regularly after seeing his example. The pride in his grandmother's eyes was unmistakable, her weathered hands clasped together as if in prayer, her smile radiating the joy of witnessing a miracle she had never dared to hope for. The next photograph showed Miguel at the community center where he volunteered, surrounded by a group of teenagers who had formed what they called the Second Chance Club, DI. These were young people who had been involved in petty crimes or were at risk of joining gangs, but had chosen a different path after hearing Miguel's story. Manny studied each face in the photo, recognizing the mixture of hope and determination he had seen in mirrors during his own journey. Miguel explained how the group met twice a week, combining study sessions with discussions about goal setting and conflict resolution. They had created their own motto, from the streets to success, one choice at a time. Among the certificates was Miguel's Academic Achievement Award from his first year of college, but more meaningful to him was a handwritten letter from a 13-year-old boy named Carlo. The child had been recruited by the same gang that had once claimed Miguel, but after attending one of Miguel's talks at the local elementary school, Carlo had decided to focus on his education instead. The letter, written in careful handwriting, thanked Miguel for showing him that being tough means staying in school, not joining gangs. Manny read the letter twice, his throat tightening as he recognized the profound impact one person's transformation could have on an entire community. Miguel shared the story of Maria, a teenage girl who had been on the verge of dropping out of school to work in a factory and help support her family. After hearing Miguel speak about the long-term benefits of education, she had approached him for advice. Together, they had found scholarship opportunities and part-time work that allowed her to continue her studies while contributing to her family's income. Maria was now in her final year of high school with plans to study nursing, and she had become a mentor to other girls facing similar pressures. Her success had inspired 3 other girls in the neighborhood to prioritize their education over immediate financial needs. The most powerful story Miguel shared was about his former gang leader, a man named Tomas, who had initially threatened Miguel for leaving the group. For months, Tomas had made Miguel's life difficult, spreading rumors and trying to sabotage his efforts to change. But as Miguel's success became undeniable and his positive influence in the community grew, Tomas began to question his own choices. The turning point came when Tomas's younger brother expressed interest in joining Miguel's study group instead of following in his older brother's footsteps. Faced with the possibility of leading his own family member down a destructive path, Tomas had approached Miguel for a private conversation. That conversation had lasted 4 hours, with Tomas sharing his own story of poverty, abandonment, and the desperate choices that had led him to a life of crime. Miguel had listened without judgment, recognizing that Tomas was trapped by circumstances and limited options rather than inherent evil. Together, they had developed a plan for Tomas to gradually distance himself from illegal activities while building legitimate skills. Miguel had connected him with a construction company owned by a community leader who believed in second chances. 6 months later, Tomas was working full-time in construction and had begun attending night classes to learn basic accounting. The transformation of the former gang leader had sent shockwaves through the community, proving that change was possible even for those who seemed beyond redemption. As the golden hour approached and the room filled with warm amber light, Manny felt compelled to share something he had never spoken about publicly. He told Miguel about the nights when the weight of being a role model felt overwhelming, when he questioned whether he was worthy of the admiration millions of people showed him. The champion described the pressure of knowing that his every action was scrutinized, that his mistakes could discourage others from pursuing their dreams. Miguel listened with deep understanding, sharing his own fears about disappointing the young people who now looked up to him as proof that change was possible. Manny reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through hundreds of messages from fans around the world. He showed Miguel some of the letters and emails he received daily from people who credited his story with helping them overcome addiction, escape abusive relationships, pursue education, or simply find the courage to keep going during difficult times. The boxing champion explained that these messages were both his greatest source of motivation and his heaviest burden. Each story represented a life that had been touched by his journey, but also a responsibility to continue living up to the example he had set. The conversation turned to Miguel's future plans, and the young man's eyes lit up as he described his vision for a comprehensive community center in Tondo. He had already begun writing a proposal for funding, combining his academic knowledge with his lived experience to create a program that would address the root causes of gang involvement. The center would offer educational support, job training, counseling services, and recreational activities. But most importantly, it would be staffed by people who had successfully transformed their own lives. Miguel believed that peer mentorship was the most powerful tool for change, as it provided both inspiration and practical guidance from people who truly understood the challenges. Manny was impressed by the thoroughness of Miguel's planning and the maturity of his vision. The young man had researched successful community programs in other countries, adapted them to the specific needs of Filipino urban communities, and developed partnerships with local schools, businesses, and government agencies. Miguel explained that he had learned from Manny's example that sustainable change required more than individual success. It demanded systematic approaches that could help entire communities break cycles of poverty and violence. His dream was to create a model that could be replicated in other barangays throughout the Philippines. As their conversation continued, Manny made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He told Miguel that he wanted to support the community center project, not just financially, but as an active partner in its development and implementation. The champion explained that he had been looking for meaningful ways to expand his charitable work beyond building schools and providing scholarships. Miguel's vision aligned perfectly with his own desire to address the deeper social issues that created the conditions he had escaped from in his youth. Together, they could create something that would have lasting impact on countless lives. The partnership they discussed would combine Manny's resources and influence with Miguel's grassroots knowledge and community connections. They talked about involving other successful individuals who had overcome similar backgrounds, creating a network of mentors who could provide diverse perspectives and expertise. Miguel suggested that the center could also serve as a research facility, documenting successful intervention strategies and sharing them with other communities facing similar challenges. The project would become a living testament to the power of transformation and the importance of giving back to the communities that shaped them. As the sun began to set outside the small window, casting the room in a gentle twilight, Miguel's composure finally broke. The weight of the day, the surreal nature of having his hero sitting in his humble home, and the overwhelming generosity of Manny's offer to support his dreams all combined to release emotions he had been holding back for hours. Tears streamed down his face as he struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude. These weren't tears of sadness, but of pure joy and disbelief that his life had led to this moment of recognition and partnership. Manny was deeply moved by Miguel's emotional response, seeing in the young man's tears a reflection of his own journey from desperation to hope. The champion reached out and placed a gentle hand on Miguel's shoulder, sharing his own tears as he thought about all the young people who were still trapped in the circumstances they had both escaped. He told Miguel that meeting him had reminded him why his success mattered beyond personal achievement. It was about proving to others that transformation was possible and then helping them find their own path to a better life. Miguel wiped his eyes and began to speak about the people who had believed in him when he had barely believed in himself. He talked about his grandmother, who had never stopped praying for his safety and success even during his darkest days with the gang. He mentioned teachers who had welcomed him back to school without judgment, employers who had given him chances despite his past, and community members who had supported his efforts to help other young people. Miguel realized that his story wasn't just about individual determination, but about the power of community support and the importance of people who refuse to give up on others. The young man shared a moment that had occurred just the week before, when a mother from the neighborhood had approached him with tears in her eyes. Her 15-year-old son had been skipping school and spending time with known gang members, but after attending one of Miguel's talks, the boy had come home and announced his intention to focus on his studies. The mother had thanked Miguel for giving her son hope and showing him a different vision of what his life could become. Miguel told Manny that moments like these made all his struggles worthwhile and gave him the strength to continue his work, even when progress seemed slow. Manny shared his own similar experiences, describing the overwhelming feeling of responsibility and gratitude that came with knowing his story had influenced others to make positive changes. He talked about visiting hospitals and meeting young patients who had found strength in his example, about receiving letters from parents whose children had been inspired to work harder in school because of his story. The champion explained that these encounters had taught him that success wasn't just about personal achievement, but about using that achievement to lift others up and create opportunities for positive change. As the room grew darker and the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening filled the air, both men reflected on the unexpected gift of their meeting. Miguel expressed amazement that a simple letter had led to this life-changing encounter, while Manny marveled at the young man's courage in reaching out and sharing his story. They both understood that this moment represented more than just a meeting between a fan and his hero. It was a connection between two people who had walked similar paths and now had the opportunity to help others navigate their own journeys toward transformation and hope. As their time together drew to a close, Manny and Miguel exchanged contact information and made concrete plans for their future collaboration. The boxing champion promised to visit Miguel's grandmother before leaving, wanting to thank the woman whose love and sacrifice had helped shape the remarkable young man sitting beside him. Miguel's eyes filled with fresh tears at this gesture, knowing how much it would mean to his grandmother to meet the man whose story had inspired her grandson's transformation. They agreed to meet again the following week to begin serious planning for the community center project. Manny stood up slowly, reluctant to end this profound encounter, but knowing that both of them had been forever changed by their conversation. He looked around the small room one final time, memorizing the details of this place where hope had taken root and flourished despite the most challenging circumstances. The boxing posters and newspaper clippings that had once seemed like simple fan memorabilia now appeared to him as symbols of faith and determination, evidence of the power of inspiration to transcend circumstances and create real change in the world. Before leaving, Manny asked Miguel to continue documenting his journey and the impact of their future work together. He suggested that Miguel's story could inspire others around the world who were facing similar struggles, and that sharing their collaborative efforts might encourage other successful individuals to invest in community-based solutions to poverty and violence. Miguel agreed enthusiastically, understanding that his role was evolving from someone who had been inspired to someone who could inspire others through his own example and work. As they walked down the narrow stairs together, neighbors began to gather, word having spread throughout the community that the boxing legend was visiting. Manny greeted each person warmly, taking time to speak with children and elderly residents, signing autographs and taking photos, but always returning his attention to Miguel and treating him as an equal partner rather than just another fan. The respect and recognition Manny showed Miguel in front of the community elevated the young man's status and reinforced his credibility as a positive force for change in the neighborhood. The visit to Miguel's grandmother was everything the young man had hoped it would be. The elderly woman wept with joy as Manny thanked her for raising such an exceptional grandson and for her role in his transformation. She shared stories of Miguel's childhood, his struggles with the gang, and her prayers for his safety and success. Manny listened with deep respect, understanding that this woman's unwavering love had been the foundation that made Miguel's change possible. He promised to stay in touch and to ensure that she was cared for as they worked together on the community center project. As Manny prepared to leave Tondo, a small crowd had gathered to see him off. Children who had heard Miguel speak at school were there, along with teenagers from the Second Chance Club and adults who had witnessed Miguel's transformation over the past 3 years. The boxing champion addressed the group briefly, praising Miguel's courage and dedication while encouraging everyone to support his continued efforts to improve their community. He emphasized that real change came from within communities themselves, led by people who understood local challenges and were committed to long-term solutions. The black SUV pulled away slowly, leaving behind a community buzzing with excitement and renewed hope. Miguel stood in the street long after the vehicle had disappeared, surrounded by neighbors who looked at him with new eyes, not just as the young man who had escaped gang life, but as someone whose story had brought one of the world's most famous athletes to their humble neighborhood. As the stars began to appear in the Manila sky, Miguel felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity settling on his shoulders. His journey from gang member to community leader had reached a new chapter, one that would be written in partnership with his childhood hero and would impact countless lives for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.